Here's the HotA build that I used to clear a Tier 100 Nightmare Dungeon on my Barb, including skills, gear, and my full Paragon setup. Later in the video I'll also be showing you guys some gameplay tricks to get the most out of this build. I'm linking a build planner in the description of this video for y'all to quickly reference this info, and I'll also keep this planner up to date if I make any changes to the build. So here's my skill tree. I'm not going to go over every point that I've allocated, but I would like to highlight a few key abilities and passives and explain why I chose them over others. For example, I went with Lunging Strike because I like the berserking it gives you, but you can also go with Flay for the extra vulnerable and damage reduction, and it's also quite good. Pressure Point is also very important because this is where the majority of our vulnerable uptime comes from. And in fact, this is why I recommend getting Lucky Hit on your gloves and maybe even rings to increase that vulnerable uptime because it's just such a big multiplier for us. So I do use Ground Stomp in my build, even though I don't have any points invested in it. I do that by getting the +3 ranks of all defensive skills on my necklace here. And I've tried putting 3 points into the Ground Stomp for you get this extra 1 second duration and 25 fury, and it feels nice, but it just doesn't feel worth the 3 points when Barb just has so many other good passives you can put those 3 points into. So Hamstring is also very important because it allows us to use stats that increase damage to slowed enemies, like I have here on my mace. And if I didn't have this point in Hamstring, then I wouldn't get any value out of this stat. Then finally, Wallop is probably Barb's best passive for increasing damage, especially if you have extra Lucky Hit on your gloves or even rings. The next major choice is Expertise. My preference is the two-handed axe for the damage, but alternatively you can run the two-handed sword mastery and switch Berserk Ripping over to Edge Masters for a more defensive setup. The most important aspect for this build is Disobedience. We put this on the necklace for the massive amount of armor it gives us. For the rings I used Bold Chieftain for my shout up time and Echoing Fury for my Fury generation. On my two-handers I used the HotA Quake, more on this later, and then Retribution because it's just the biggest damage multiplier. I use Berserk Ripping here to cause bleeding for the various bonuses it provides. We keep it on the one-hander because we don't really care about the bleeding damage. We just want the monsters to be bleeding. I use Limitless Rage on my other one-hander because the damage multiplier is higher than Edge Masters, but both are good. I used to run Edge Masters here on the gloves, but I swapped it to Burning Rage, and this is just for the extra stacks to Disobedience. I use Exploiters on boots for the extra damage to Unstoppable, and then for the other defensive aspects I use Might and Iron Blood for general damage reduction, and then I use Numbing Wrath on my pants for more Fortify. However, Steadfast Berserker is likely a better option if you have an extra Lucky Hit on your gear. So now I'm going to go over each piece of gear and list the stats that I'm looking for in order of importance. You'll notice that there's still quite a bit of room to improve my gear. For helmet, I'm looking for cooldown reduction, total armor, max life, and max fury. On chests, I want challenging shout, total armor, damage reduction from close, and damage reduction while fortified. On gloves, ranks of HotA, critical strike chance, attack speed, and lucky hit chance. I got all stats instead of lucky hit, which I think lucky hit's a little bit better, but all stats are okay too. You'd be fine with like strength or dex or something. For pants, you're gonna want total armor, damage reduction from close, damage reduction while fortified, and max life. For boots, movement speed, fury cost reduction, berserking duration, and ideally damage reduction while injured, just for an extra defensive bucket, since it's kind of free on the boots. It doesn't really cost you any other defensive stats. However, I got the dexterity. I think strength would also be better than the dex, but my preference would be damage reduction while injured. For amulet, I want plus ranks to defensive skills, cooldown reduction, percent armor, and then for the last space, you can go wallop, heavy-handed, or fury cost reduction, or even another reduction style like a reduction from close or reduction while fortified would be pretty good. For your rings, you're going to want critical strike chance, resource generation, and max life on both. But for your fourth stat, you could really go critical strike damage, vulnerable damage, or lucky hit, and all of those would be pretty good. And for the weapon, on your bludgeoning weapon, you want to make sure you have the highest attack power you can get. And then beyond that, for the actual stats on your weapon, you want critical strike damage, vulnerable damage, strength, and all stats. So for your chest and pants, you don't need these exact damage reduction stats. For example, you could have damage reduction from close and damage reduction from bleeding enemies here on your chest. But if you did that, you would also want to have the damage reduction from close and damage reduction from bleeding on your pants, right? That's the most important thing, because by matching the reduction stats on your chest and your pants, you minimize the diminishing returns that you get from these reduction stats and therefore maximize your damage reduction. And if you'd like to know more about how that works, I just uploaded an entire video on optimizing damage reduction that I'll be linking down in the description. So I'm not going to go into detail on it in this video. For your weapons, you always want to use 3 swords for the implicit critical strike damage they have. For your pants, you want the potion grants max life as barrier while injured. And then for boots, ideally you want max evade charges for your implicit, but the movement speed on evade is also pretty good. I'm going to quickly go over my Paragon setup by showing all the glyphs and boards I'm using. So in the starting board, I'm running Territorial. Then on Weapons Master, I have Martial. On Warbringer, I have Wrath. On Decimator, I have Might. On Bonebreaker, I have Exploit. And then on Flawless Technique, I have Undaunted. One of the most important ways to maximize the damage output of this build is by properly using the Ancestral Force aspect that we put on our two-handed weapon. In this clip, I show myself using this technique to do a little bit more damage to the Brood Guard. If you notice here, when I'm throwing out my hammers, I don't actually use it directly on the monster. Instead, you want to use it next to the monster. That way, instead of hitting them with the main hammer, you're hitting them with this quake effect. And for whatever reason, that does more damage. It's probably a bugged interaction, but for now, that's the best way to utilize this aspect. The way you do this on PC is by using the hold position command that you can find here in key bindings under controls. When you do the hold position, you can use your attacks like lunging strike or HotA without actually having a target to use them on, right? So by doing it this way, instead of clicking directly on the monster, I just do it next to the monster. Another important concept for this build is playing around your challenging shout. It gives you a ton of damage reduction, and it's very hard to fight these monsters without your challenging shout. If you have a bunch of disobedience charges, sometimes you can, but typically what you'll see me do, and what you see in this clip, is I'll use my challenging shout and then run in and fight this guy, and then as my challenging shout wears off, I back out and I kite. And I do this with regular, like, normal packs of monsters as well, but because we have the Bold Chieftain, the cooldown time isn't quite as noticeable when there's a bunch of monsters around. But when it's a single elite like this, or a single boss, you really have to be careful with the way you kite, because you do not want to get hit by these monsters when you don't have your challenging shout up. Another trick that you can do is respeccing your skill points in the middle of a dungeon. I often do this before I fight a boss, and did so in my Tier 100 Blind Burrows clear, because the build that I was running to progress through the dungeon is not optimal for the boss fight. So I just want to show you guys the changes I made. So I take these 3 points out of No Mercy because my slows don't work on the boss, and then I take the 3 points out of Concussion because I stagger the boss fine without it, right? So instead I put 1 point there into Raid Leader. That gives me more sustain, and 2 points into Aggressive Resistance for more damage reduction. Then I dump 2 more points into Invigorating Fury there, and that gives me even more sustain. Right, so the idea here is that I know this boss fight is going to be very long, so I want as much sustain as I can get. That way I can fight that boss for as long as it's going to take to kill him. Thank you all so much for watching my video. I'm brand new to YouTube, so if you guys have any feedback for me on how I could make my videos better, or you'd like further clarification on anything, please leave me a comment below.